Good morning again. The kids 12 and under are dismissed to go back to lunch. I gotta say already, it's going to be hard to stand up here and preach a message while smelling that tantalizing aroma coming from the back of the church building. I wonder if they set up this way on purpose so that the preacher's message would be short. Yeah. Well, it's not. Now, starting back on October 29th, I began this series with Matthew chapter 5, starting with Matthew 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, this morning is actually going to be my final sermon, specifically on that verse and that topic of pride versus humility for this series that I've been doing on Beatitudes. Starting next week, we'll actually take a break on this series, focus on the season that we're in until after the New Year's holiday, and then we'll pick back up and move on to Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, following that. But moving back to today, I want to start by saying that it was Jesus himself that said, if anyone desires to come after me, in other words, if you desire to be my disciple, my follower, this applies to us today, just as it did to those he was speaking to 2,000 years ago. He said, let him deny himself, take up his cross, which I want to point out is not something pretty. It was an instrument of death. Jesus said this even before going to the cross. It was an instrument of torture and shame. Let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And then it was the Apostle Paul who spoke in the book of Romans quite extensively on how the believer should be putting the flesh, or that self that Jesus is talking about, to death. So I wanted to take a look at pride from one final angle. And as I've already said multiple times, and as I hope that I have clearly shown each week, this first beatitude deals with a subject that is a very sneaky sin, one that can infiltrate us in a multitude of different ways without us even knowing it. And so just as a very quick recap on the different ways, the first week we looked at exactly what Jesus meant when he said, poor in spirit. That's destitute is that word that they use for poor there. And I spoke generically about pride, about how this we need to be able to look for everything that we are from God, and also about how this world always seems to promote the opposite of humility, which of course is pride. How it tells us to be proud of everything, especially our sin, and how we should be suspect whenever the world is telling us to show pride in something for this reason. The second week, I spoke on the deceptiveness of pride. And I read to you the story of the rich young ruler who came to Jesus seeking eternal life. And we talked about how in all other areas he was willing to follow the law. He was willing to be righteous, so to speak. Yet we also talked about how he walked away from Christ that day sorrowful, with his head down. When Jesus pointed out his hidden pride, which he had in his wealth, that he didn't even realize was an issue, he didn't want to do anything to be able to overcome it. That's where he thought his joy came from. And I talked about how we can have these hidden areas as well, where pride will deceptively keep us in our spiritual bondage to sin, and we won't even see what it's doing. And the third week, we looked at King David and how his pride in his position of glory as the monarch had caused him to sin, and then to sin some more, to cover up the first sin by murdering Bathsheba's husband after he had an affair with her, the Bible tells us. But then we saw a reversal of his public example of humility through the Psalms, and how he eventually rejected his pride when Nathan the prophet was sent to him to call him out on his sin and his hidden pride. And unlike the rich young ruler from the week before, when his pride or his sin was called out, David changed. He gave an example to us. Then we looked at Mary's excellent example of humility, and how she risked everything, including her life, in order to accept the Lord's calling for her in bearing the Son of God, and how she swallowed all natural pride for what she desired in this life, and how we should now do the same, that we should put our own personal desires or our pride in what we want to decide when it conflicts with God's plan for us. And then likewise, finally, last week, we examined Joseph, the man that was able to put his wounded pride to the side and to humbly honor his family and the Lord. And by learning from his example how we should be honoring our family in all things, even when our pride is wounded by them as well. So there's many different ways. There are all sorts of various ways that pride can invade our lives without us even realizing that pride itself is the issue or behind the problem. In fact, all of those are great examples of how pride, which is the natural thing for us to do, destroys not just us, but those around us as well. Those that we love, and even strangers. But humility, on the other hand, we can see through these examples, which is difficult, and doesn't come naturally to us. It requires the denial of self, like Jesus spoke about, promotes life and peace, positivity, and it affects more people than we even realize. In fact, today, for this final sermon on this subject, we are going to look at the greatest example of humility ever shown in all of human history. And that would be perfect humility. And what it still means for you and I today, how it's still positively affecting others. So I have 3 different texts I'm going to read right now, one right after another. And the first one is actually going to be out of the book of Mark. And I'm going to be in the 14th chapter, and I'm going to read verses 32 through 37. And this is Jesus, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is going through literal emotional anguish at this point in time. And I want you to see everything that's going on and how even his friends, the disciples that he had actually just called his friends, he said, "No longer do I call you servants, but I call you friends." Even they are unwilling to check their flesh and to stay with him and to pray with him. And so he's going through this time alone. And so again, it's verses 32 through 37. And this is what it says. It says, "They came to a place which was named Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly troubled and distressed." They could see how distressed Jesus was. "And he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch.'" He's asking them to do something. And so he went forward a little, and he fell on the ground, and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass away from him. Now again, I'm just going to stop there for just a second. Jesus knew why he came. He already told the disciples why he came. But this is how much emotional anguish that he's in, that he prays, if it's possible, if there's another way, that the Lord would do it. He said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Please remove this cup from me. However, not what I desire, but what you desire." And he came and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Couldn't you watch just 1 hour?" Now, I want to skip over to the book of Hebrews. I'm just going to read 3 short verses there, which are commentary on Jesus going to the cross and enduring all of this anguish and pressing forward, even though his emotions told him otherwise. And if you're familiar with the book of Hebrews, you know that the 11th chapter is actually what they would be considered the faith chapter. And it mentions many people out of the Old Testament and how they overcame things. But then he starts the 12th chapter with the greatest example, which is Jesus. Again, I'm just going to read the first 3 verses, and it says this. "Therefore, let's also, seeing that we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily entangles us," or let's put self to the side, "and let's run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus." This is the culmination of the faith chapter. Looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. He's saying the one who created it and also perfected it, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, hiding its shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, that you do not grow weary, fainting in your souls. And before I read the third text that I have, I just want to ask this. How could Jesus endure this contradiction that he's talking about? What possibly could he have felt joy about that night when his friends had not taken it seriously? He's about to be betrayed by one of his own disciples. He's going to go to a horrible death. But yet the writer of Hebrews tells us that for the joy that was set before him, so much joy, that he chose to still humble himself, to say, Father, not my will, but yours be done, and to do so for the whole world, including those who couldn't stay awake with him for that 1 hour, and also including those who were about to come murder him, as well as you and I that are here today. So what was this joy that Jesus had before him? And so that brings me to my final text, which is the book of Revelation. We're going to go to the end of the Bible, chapter 22, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 8. And the Apostle John is having a vision of the future. And this is what he sees. It says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and the sea is no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice out of heaven saying, Behold, God's dwelling is with people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Neither will there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore. For the first things, that means this whole world system that we're used to, have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. He said, Write, for these words of God are faithful and true. And he said to me, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give freely to him who is thirsty from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes, I will give him these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly, unbelieving, sinners, abominable murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their part is in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Now, to switch gears here for a second, it's interesting to me how I really believe that for all of us, in our culture, there comes a day where we just sort of wake up in our youthful optimism that we all start out with for this world kind of dies. And we recognize just how evil this planet truly is. Even though as Christians, we should already know this because we have the Word of God that tells us this, how evil unchecked humanity is when it goes without God. And yet it still seems when we see this happen all around us to rob us of our joy. It turns us into cynical people. Ultimately, selfish people, since we can't trust anyone else. We can only look out for ourselves, we think, in this life. And that can even happen to us in the church. It can even happen to us as preachers. Personally, for myself, I think it was the first year that I was a full-time preacher, and I had 3 precious little children that I was responsible for to raise in this world. In fact, my very first Sunday at the Martinsburg Church of Christ as the minister was Gracie's very first Sunday at church. She had just been born. And so I was thinking a lot about my kids. And so I started to really pay attention to the news and things that were going on around me, namely because I was talking about it so much and using it as illustrations in my sermons, but also because I was closely watching this world that I knew that my kids were going to inherit. In fact, many times I made the mistake of only worrying about this temporary, materialistic world, only worrying about self and the things that they were going to inherit, and not worrying enough about the next world, which we read about in the book of Revelation, the one that is permanent. So my focus was on the here, is what I'm trying to say. It was more on the physical. Now, the year that I'm referring to was 2017. You remember much about what happened that year? And I would actually say that the answer for most of you is probably not. In fact, compared to the last 3 years, 2017 probably seems pretty tame. But it actually wasn't. In fact, on October 1st of that year, at about 9:40 p.m. in Las Vegas, country music singer Jason Aldean walked out on stage. He started his performance at what was called the Route 91 Harvest Festival in front of a crowd of more than 22,000 people who were there expecting only to have a good time, just listening to music, and to go back home and live their lives as normal the next day. But 28 minutes later, after he walked out there, one man from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel, which overlooked this concert, made sure that no one that night, from the singer himself all the way down to the last person in attendance, would ever think that life was normal again when he opened fire on this unsuspecting crowd. He killed 58 people, and he injured over 500 in what was described at the time as the worst mass shooting in American history. But I think that what hit me so much when that happened was that was not the only major tragedy that had taken place that year. In fact, Time magazine put it this way in one of their magazines. They said in 2017, if you could see grief on a map, there would be rings of anguish radiating from whole regions of the United States right now. So a few other things that were going on is Puerto Rico had almost been completely destroyed with a terrible hurricane. There were many people that were dying, that were living without electric or running water because of this. Likewise, Texas and Florida were years in the rebuilding for the same problem. We also saw the beginning of new racial tensions come to fruition in Charlottesville that year, where there were demonstrations that erupted into this riot with people beating each other on both sides and then calling it into a car driving full speed into the crowd to try and kill as many people as possible. Pure hatred. And this wasn't just an American phenomenon either. There was unrest that year in the entire world. So that year, the people of Guam, if you'll remember, they were kind of nervously waiting every morning to find out if their island would continue to exist or not, because North Korea kept threatening very seriously that they were going to drop a nuclear bomb on this island. And also at the time, the people of Europe, they were literally taking their lives in their hands every day just to go out into the cities and do mundane tasks that we all take for granted, never knowing when a member of ISIS was going to drive a vehicle into a crowd of people, or when the next bomb in the subway or a crowded place was going to go off. Again, pure evil, hatred, and a lot of grief. And then there were the governments themselves that were also oppressing and torturing and killing their own people, either for their faith or for their political beliefs. And it was that same year, if you'll remember, that United States diplomats were the victims of a sonic blast in Cuba, which took away their hearing. Now, if that wasn't enough, it wasn't safe anymore to go to church. Because in 2017, on Palm Sunday, there were 2 Christian churches in Egypt that were bombed as people went in to worship. And then in September of that year, at a Church of Christ near Nashville, Tennessee, a former congregant who hadn't even attended there in a very long time, and they didn't know why he did this, came into the building wearing a mask and just started shooting people. And then in August, somebody walked into a library in Clovis, New Mexico. They opened fire, and the world was perplexed at how to deal or how to prevent these events, because there was really not much you could do to prevent them. And my point is here we are in the year 2023, and the scary part is you probably didn't even remember most of those things that I just described because of all the oppression and anguish and the tragedies that have taken place since. This was almost 3 years before a global pandemic and lockdowns and race riots. And now we are 3 years after this, and we've seen even more troubles. Everywhere you turn, there's heartache and grief. There are people suffering from the events of the world all around us, and as time moves forward, they only become more frequent and more tragic instead of getting better. And they leave people questioning why. They've left America very cynical. This is not the same country from even when I was just a little boy. Nobody trusts anyone anymore. The love of many has grown cold, as Jesus said. And yet, even worse than a sour national mood, I've mentioned that several of these events took place inside of churches and towards Christians. And they've left many of us wondering how that could happen. For centuries, the church has said, come to us in your time of tragedy. Let God comfort you. And yet now, we seem to be the very ones being attacked in the very places that used to be considered safe. But here's what I find interesting. If you turn on much of American Christian television today, instead of hearing answers of hope about these types of things, you'll hear many people saying all sorts of things about the Christian walk that just aren't true. And they'll lead you to believe that if you accept Christ, if you become a regular contributor, that nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. That if you're paying your tithe and you're giving to their ministry, that nothing is going to be able to touch you, that you're going to have the best job, you'll be dining at the finest restaurants, you'll drive by and you'll see things like car accidents, but you'll never be in one. Your neighbor's house is going to get broken into, but yours is going to be untouched. And while everyone else is dealing with these tragedies or one of these catastrophes, you're going to be fine. In fact, I've actually heard it preached that if you do face that type of grief, then your faith is not in tune with God. But actually, I'll tell you what I've heard preached. The opposite of what Jesus said. A faith not in God, but in this material, self-centered world. In things that are very temporary. You don't hear the faith of Job taught, for example, where Job said, and he had had everything taken away from him, and he had gone through all of these tragedies, and yet Job was still able to say, even though he was struggling with it, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. But instead, we hear in a faith of, give me what I want. I should never have to be uncomfortable. But the fact of the matter is, what I'm trying to say is if the Son of God Himself experienced grief, experienced loss, and experienced overwhelming emotion, then so will we. And Jesus told us this. But our job is to see what He did with it. How He never let it stop Him or control His faith. How He never let it rob Him of His overall joy that was set before Him, as the writer of Hebrews says. How the only man to ever live who could be prideful, Jesus could have been prideful. He was God in the flesh. He never sinned. Yet He chose not to be for your sake. Now here's my point in all of that. For what seems to be the majority of Christians in Western civilization, when the material world is shaken, many times, so is our faith. Ask yourselves, how many times have you questioned God because of some personal tragedy or grief? And I'm not trying to get you to feel bad for having emotion. Jesus obviously had emotion. But what I'm more concerned about is the total lack of true joy that many times we have because of our cynicism. A turn to only caring about our individual well-being instead of the overall goal. And we can only draw one conclusion from this when this happens. And one conclusion, if we find it totally impossible to look forward to the joy that's set before us as well, that I read about today, and act on faith and not emotion, and that is, our Master might not be who we thought it was. Now I want you to remember, from the second week of this series, which I already mentioned, the text that I used about Jesus and the rich young ruler. Because at the end of that encounter, Christ made the statement that it would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into God's kingdom. I want you to think about that. That's a drastic statement that he's saying. For a camel to go through the eye of a needle, it would be easier for that to happen. Now, was Jesus just being cruel and unfair to people that are lucky enough to be wealthy when He said that? Now, He went on to say, we keep reading, that all things are possible with God. But that still doesn't take away from the seriousness of the original message that He was trying to convey there. In fact, I want to remind us that all through the Gospels, Jesus makes very clear, very scary, ultimatum type statements that we in American Christianity like to kind of ignore by trying to gloss them over with certain things. Like, for example, we like to say that we don't need to worry about harboring feelings of hatred towards others inside of us. We'll say we've asked Christ into our life, we've been washed with the blood of Christ. It doesn't matter that I hate somebody else, and we'll totally whitewash over Matthew chapter 6, verse 14 through 15, for example, where Jesus himself said, "For if you forgive others of their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you." But then he said this, "But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you your trespasses." And we like to ignore things like that Jesus said, but the fact of the matter is, he made a very clear statement in another place in regards to the situation of that rich young ruler, but also one that applies to us today. And he made it in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, when he said this. He said, "No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and will despise the other." And now here comes the ultimatum type statement. Here comes the line drawn in the sand moment from Jesus. Jesus said, "You cannot serve both God and mammon." Now here's where we in America should pay very close attention to what Jesus just said there. Because for one, I don't think we really have a clue on what Jesus is talking about when he says mammon. We don't really know what mammon actually is. There's a lot of confusion about this word, and even some newer translations will just translate it generically as money. In fact, back in medieval times, there was still confusion about this word. Many scholars interpreted mammon as meaning a demon of covetousness. And sometimes I think we probably prefer it to be that way, because then we can say, well, I know that I'm not bowing down to a demon, so I'm not serving mammon. And it's not that demons aren't real or that they don't influence, but many times I think we like to blame our problems on the devil when the actual blame belongs on the God of self. So I want to define this word today so that there's no question here. Because mammon is actually an Aramaic word that Jesus used here. And according to Oxford, the appropriate definition of mammon is wealth, but it doesn't stop there. Wealth regarded as an evil influence or false object of worship and devotion. In other words, allowing your life to be dictated by material things. It's not just talking about money. Or to be totally devoted to materialistic things that we love, that give us pleasure. Things that we love more than we love our relationship with God. Now, we have a very skewed perception of wealth and materialism in the United States because we're such a wealthy nation. We look at this word mammon, and we might think that it applies to people like Bill Gates, the Elon Musk, Donald Trump, that Amazon guy, all of these people that are filthy rich, people who have so much money that they don't know what to do with it, but not the rest of us with our daily struggles and trying to figure out how to pay our bills. We think it doesn't apply to us. In fact, I could probably today look at my own finances. I could look at my student debt and other issues that I deal with, and I could probably safely assume that because of that, there probably aren't too many people in this room today who would want to trade me places if we compared apples to oranges. So then I could mistakenly assume that because of that I don't need to worry about this warning about mammon or materialism from Jesus. In fact, I've made that mistake in the past and not worried about it. I could blind myself to something so serious that Christ said devotion to it makes it impossible for me to also have Him as my master. In fact, I grew up in a way that many here today would probably view as dirt poor. We lived in a rented house. Many times I wondered if we were going to be able to pay the rent. Sometimes we weren't able to, or if we were going to have to find another place to live. It was a house that was not in good shape, needed a lot of repairs that never got done. I remember we ate fish sticks a lot for meals because back then they were very cheap. Many times one or more of the utilities might be turned off for a time. This was how I grew up. And as I grew up and went off into the world myself, I wanted to make things better And so I just immediately, kind of in a hurry, got a loan, bought a house myself, didn't know what I was doing. I was 21 years old. I didn't know that I was buying a money pit that had been built in 1860. Last update was during the presidential administration of Abraham Lincoln. That's what we're talking about here. And without the real financial means to do anything about it, just getting started, I just sort of covered problems up as I found them because I couldn't fix them. In fact, the cover-ups were so bad, and they were bad, I didn't know what I was doing. But they were so bad that later, I owned this house for many years before I met Shelly, and later when Shelly and I were just dating, we were not engaged, we were just the early stages of us dating, we had an argument over one of these cover-ups that I was doing. And I'll never forget her last words in that argument, and I've never let her forget those last words, because I still kind of find it funny. But she was going to help me do this project, but I was doing it my way, and so I was planning on doing whatever I was going to do just to cover up the actual problem. Again, it wasn't a fix. And so she did not like what I was doing, and she looked at me in disgust as we're getting ready to start this project, and she said, "Well, at least I don't have to live here." She ate those words for 7 years, that she called that house her home. Now, my point is this. Together we were able to slowly do actual repairs over the years. It took a long time. We still hadn't done all what we wanted to do when we sold it, because never once, even together, were we considered wealthy by American standards during that time period of our life. So I never heeded this warning that Jesus made, or even understood really that it applied to me. I never saw how focused on self and the material world that I actually was. That is, I never understood it until when COVID hit, and I lost my other job aside from the ministry that I was doing, and God told Shelly and I very strongly to get rid of it all. All that we did have, which I realized was actually a lot of things that I did love, that I was holding on to, and He told us to do it by faith. And then I understood how guided my life really was by these things that I wanted more than I wanted to serve Him. He told me to give up the stability of what I had truly trusted in, the actual mammon that was the master of my life, to get rid of it all and to head out west, down to New Mexico, to this mission trip that we did, without the security of an income, to the Navajo Reservation, on a mission trip, where I could see what true poverty actually looked like. And that true poverty made me look filthy rich in comparison, in my old way of life. I've told you before certain things. Hitchhikers everywhere down there, because many couldn't even afford to have a car. In fact, the government tried to fix this for them, and somehow they did this program where they could get a car. And guess what? Those cars sat in the driveway because they couldn't afford gas for the car. That's how poor they were. And even if they could afford something like that, they couldn't afford insurance or any of those things. It was a type of poverty where I've told you before, where I've met two men whose wives literally froze to death in the desert. And one of them were still living in that same small travel trailer in the winter with no windows in it, no electricity. But what I didn't tell you about that particular incident was that before I dropped that man off, he prayed for me. A place where there were billboards up just outside of the reservation reminding people that 2 out of every 5 little native girls on that reservation are raped. Where there was no indoor plumbing. There weren't even doors on the outhouses. And where people had to travel for miles just to get water, not knowing where their next meal was coming from or if there would be one. And yet, I found some of the most joyful Christians and some of those poor people whose faith in God was unshakable. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have emotion. It doesn't mean that they enjoyed their situations, but they had a joy that many wouldn't understand, a peace that surpassed human understanding that Paul talked about. And the more I think about it, the more I believe that that experience was actually to show me my own spiritual poverty than it was for me to do anything for them. And I felt guilty for all of the times that I questioned God back home. Questioned Him about my circumstances. Told Him that my situation wasn't fair. Wondered what I believed. When I had a vehicle, I had a roof, I had a toilet, I had power, water, and never once worried that I wasn't going to eat something. Yet some of these destitute natives that I met had a greater faith and a more pure joy in God than me, even though they had nothing, and their human existence was full of natural sorrow. You see, I got to see how prideful and selfish I actually was. The God of mammon, or the trust in the material world, had blinded me of the true joy set before me and the promise of the restoration of God, of what we're looking for. I didn't care about what John saw in the book of Revelation. I didn't really care about spreading the good news, to be honest with you. I wanted good things now. That's not what our faith is about. And this mammon or this materialism can also control our lack of joy in other ways than just the traditional thought of just, well, many times we worry about our physical body more than we do our eternal soul. Again, that's leaning towards materialism. In fact, a few months ago, I read a book by a man named Richard Wurmbrand. And this book was a true spiritual eye-opener for me. The name of this book is Tortured for Christ. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it. That it'd be up towards the top of your list, but under the Bible. And it was all about what this man and other Christians endured in his home country of Romania. First, when the Nazis took over during World War II, but then later under Russian communist rule. And I think that it gives us an excellent description of what the writer of Hebrews meant when he talked about what Jesus chose to endure for the joy that was set before him, and how we can see it applied now to a believer's life. Because you see, prior to the Russian occupation, Richard, who wrote this book, was a happily married man. They had a young son. He was the pastor of what I'll call an institutional church where he lived, and he lived a life much like you or I would. But when the Russians and communism took over, they came in and they closed most of the churches. But they allowed some of them to remain open to be what this man described as a show church. But the government actually demanded that the ministers of these churches, the ones that they left in charge, or these spiritual shepherds of these churches, they demanded that they should be traitors to their own flock, and that they should report to the secret police anytime they felt that someone in their congregation was actually getting too serious about their faith. And the reason for this was because they were trying to accomplish an atheistic society. They were trying to get people to trust in the government and not into God. So Richard, when he realized what was going on and what was going to be forced of him if he stayed, he began to operate in what was known as the underground church, so that he could continue to preach the truth about Jesus Christ. And basically what the underground church was illegal churches that would meet in houses or in barns, places not official like this, so that they wouldn't get caught because they would be arrested. And he was arrested, and he spent 14 years being tortured for his faith in Jesus. And he was tormented on a daily basis because they were trying to get him to betray other brethren in this underground church and to give up their names so that they could squash it. And when I say torture, he spoke in this book of many things, such as they had handcuffs where they would put nails on the inside. They would put them on their wrists so that anytime you moved, it would pierce your skin. They had a wooden box, much like a coffin, where you would have to stand up in it. It had blades on either side, and they would leave them in there for days. So if they started to knot off, they would go into one of these sharp blades. They would take him into a room where they would have a freezer on. They would leave him there naked, and they would had a doctor on the other side of the window watching for signs of hypothermia. They would bring him out and warm him up and then put him back in and do it all over again. And they did things even worse than this. He said they did things so bad that he wouldn't even write about it because they were so terrible just thinking about them would keep him up at night. And yet, even after all of these atrocities, this is my point, he wrote in that book about his great love for his captors. He kept speaking about an inner joy that he had in the middle of all this sorrow, the whole time he was being abused. His hope for what was coming, but also a strong desire to spread the gospel even to his abusers, so that they could also join in that hope. And where most of us would have hated these men for taking every materialistic thing that we possess away from us, including our family and our dignity, the freedom of controlling our bodies, Richard Wurmbrand said this. He said in that book, and I truly want you to understand the pure theology behind this statement. He said, I learned from them. As they allowed no place for Jesus in their hearts, I decided I would leave not the smallest place for Satan in mine. Talk about a true devotion to the correct master. A denying of self. And this was not unique to just this man. He also wrote about the great joy of all these imprisoned Christians felt in the middle of this grief. In fact, he shared this story where he said, I was later in prison together with souls whom God had helped me to win for Christ, people that he had met on the outside that he had witnessed to, and then they ended up getting arrested later. And he said, I was in the same cell with one who had left behind 6 children, and who was now in prison for his Christian faith. His wife and children were starving. He might never see them again. And I asked him, in that cell, have you any resentment against me that I brought you to Christ? And because of this, your family is in such misery. And he answered, I have no words to express my thankfulness that you have brought me to the wonderful Savior, and I would never have it any other way. Now my question is, do we have that kind of joy set before us? Where we can be stripped of everything and everyone, every materialistic thing, everything of self that we love, and still say because of Jesus and what we know is coming, that we would never have it any other way? Are we willing to lose everything and yet still have an inner peace in spite of that type of anguish? I mean, we get a flat tire in our society and we get mad at God. This man lost his wife and family, but he had peace because he knew that ultimately he had gained them eternally because they were all Christians. But here's the most interesting thing, and I'm coming towards a close now, but here's the most interesting thing that I found in that book. This man experienced unspeakable horrors under communists, but yet he was far more horrified by what he found when he got out. In the late 60s, he was ransomed out of Romania and was allowed to come to the United States, where his fellow brothers and sisters in the underground church encouraged him to go so that he could spread awareness over here about what was going on over there behind the Iron Curtain. And when he got to America, and remember, this is all the way back in the 60s, we're talking a while back, he could not believe what he saw happening in the free church. In fact, it was such a culture shock for him that he literally missed what he called the beauty of the fellowship of the underground church that he had while he was in prison. And I want you to understand that. The beauty of a church that was physically, had everything taken away from him. And he wrote this. He said, since being in the West, I have visited many theological seminaries. There I've heard lectures about the history of bells, the history of songs, about laws long since disused, or about church discipline that no longer exists, things that we argue about. I've heard that some students of theology learned that the biblical story of creation is not true, nor that of Adam, nor the flood, nor the miracles of Moses. Some are taught that the prophecies were written after their fulfillment. I was taught that in school. I didn't believe it, but I was taught that. They're taught that the virgin birth is a myth. Likewise, the resurrection of Jesus, that his bones have remained somewhere in a grave, that the epistles are not genuine, and that Revelation is the book of a madman. Otherwise, they say that the Bible is a holy book. That is what some present Western church leaders learned when they were in seminaries. That is the atmosphere in which they live. And then he asks this, why should they be faithful to a master about whom such strange things are said? Why should church leaders be faithful to a church in which it can be freely taught that God is dead? Some leaders of denominations are not of the bride of Christ. They are leaders in a church in which many have long since betrayed the master. And when they meet someone of the underground church, a martyr, they look at him strangely because of the peace that he has. Betrayed the master. But I'll tell you what, as it applies to the topic today, the actual saddest thing that he said in that book was this, and I truly believe this man had a right to say this. He said, I have found truly joyful Christians only in the Bible, in the underground church, and in prison. Now that statement should break our hearts. And I started this sermon with the text of Jesus in Gethsemane for a reason. I don't care what anyone else says. If Jesus endured the emotions that come with betrayal, with pain, torture, and impending doom, so much so that he, knowing why he came in the first place, still asked the Father to take this cup away from him. Like I said earlier, so will you and I. That part is a given, and we need to reject any teaching that says otherwise. But we also need to understand that it won't just be the global or the national tragedies that we see happening. It will also be the personal things that affect us as well. We might not all go to a physical cross like Jesus. We might not spend 14 years of torture in prison like Richard Wormran, but we will still have our setbacks. We will have our losses in life, our health failures, our betrayals, our own tragedies that affect our material world. And yes, even our times like Jesus on the cross, where we don't feel, emotionally speaking, the Father in that moment. But even when Jesus felt that, and even when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He still did not call for those angels to save him that he said he could. He finished the course because of his perfection of that pure, humble, and selfless faith that Hebrews talked about. Amen. So the question today is, what are we looking towards when those things happen to us? What is the joy that is set before us? That's really been the message of this sermon series so far. In so many ways, we've messed up. But God, in His great mercy, He has taken our story of hopelessness and He's offered us a restored paradise, a renewal of what we were originally created to be with Him before the curse. God has offered a second chance where He Himself will wipe every tear from our sorrowful eyes. There'll be no more death. There's going to be a new earth where all things are going to be as it should be. But He is asking us to lay our human pride to the side and return. That if our true God in this life is materialism, which we need to understand how true that is for probably most people in America, then as the various trials of this world start to shake all around us and the material things that we actually serve without realizing it start to disappear, and our true master also dissipates, and our house of cards is going to come crumbling down. And all that's going to be left of our faith is the feeling that the walls have closed in and there's no hope and there's no joy. And that's why Richard Wormran, who wrote that book, was so concerned with the American church. It's why I feel like God has put this type of message in my mouth for the church in America. Because it's why Jesus said you can't serve two masters. It's why the Apostle Peter said in 2 Peter 1:10, therefore, brothers, be more diligent to make your calling and election sure. It's why Joshua said in Joshua 24:15, choose you this day whom you will serve. Make a choice. But it's also why God said in Isaiah 65, I've spread out my hands all day long to a rebellious people. God wants to be our master. He wants us to be a part of this great restoration plan. He desires to personally wipe every tear from our eyes, to give us the joy of knowing what can be ours. He's not asking us to blindly bow down to some impersonal cosmic force. He's asking you to surrender your pride willingly to the Savior of Gethsemane, the one who showed us that it's possible to do so, the one who surrendered His self and His life and His emotions to the Father for each of us. He's asking us to join with Him in an eternal restoration that is far greater than any temporary materialistic thing that this world has to offer. So if your emotions are crippling you and stopping you from moving forward in faith because you cannot see the bigger picture beyond this self-centered materialistic world that's all around us, and you don't have that joy that's set before you that you can cling to and move forward like Jesus did, then it's time to ask yourself where your true devotion is. Is it to self in this material world, or have you made your calling and election sure? Have you rejected the God of Mammon and asked yourself, who is your master? And if you don't know, then come forward this morning as the last song is played and deny self as Jesus did and make your master Jesus Christ. You would bow your heads. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.